The crisp autumn morning in Boulder, Colorado, had just begun when I fired up my chainsaw at 8:30, and I barely managed to make 3 cuts into the dead oak tree in my backyard before Patricia Brennan came storming across my lawn like she owned the place. I am Blake Garrison, and I had lived at 2847 Meadowbrook Lane for 3 years without major incident. Sure, there were the usual HOA letters about leaving my trash cans visible for 2 hours past pickup time, or that one complaint about my lawn being a quarter-inch too tall, but nothing prepared me for what was about to unfold. I worked as a licensed arborist and tree service specialist for the past 12 years, running my own company called Garrison Tree Solutions. The dead oak in my backyard had been dropping branches for months, and after the last windstorm nearly sent a massive limb through my kitchen window, I decided enough was enough. Patricia stood at the edge of my property line, her hands on her hips, her bleached blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. She wore a lavender tracksuit that probably cost more than my chainsaw, and her face was already turning the shade of an overripe tomato. "Excuse me," she shouted over the sound of my Stihl MS-271, which I immediately shut off. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" I pulled off my safety goggles and gloves, taking a deep breath to maintain my composure. "It's 8:30 in the morning, Patricia. Good morning to you too." The HOA noise ordinance clearly states no power tools or loud equipment before noon on weekends, she said, pulling out her phone and jabbing at the screen. "I'm documenting this violation right now. That's a $500 fine for first offense." I set down my chainsaw on the wooden work platform I had set up. "Actually, Patricia, I'm a licensed tree service professional. The municipal noise ordinance exempts licensed tree services from those restrictions because dead trees pose safety hazards that need immediate attention." Her eyes narrowed to slits. "You're doing work on your own property. That doesn't count as running a business. You're just a homeowner using power tools and you're in violation. I'd be happy to show you my state arborist license and business certification. The law doesn't differentiate between working on my property or someone else's when it comes to safety exemptions. This tree is dead and dangerous." Patricia stepped closer, her designer sneakers crushing some of the wood chips I had laid down around the work area. "I don't care what kind of made-up exemptions you think you have. The HOA rules supersede everything else, and you will be receiving a fine in the mail. If you continue with this noise, I'll call the police for disturbing the peace." I felt my jaw tighten. 3 years of dealing with this woman's petty tyranny had worn thin my patience. "You know what, Patricia? Go ahead and send the fine. I'll be contesting it with documentation from both my professional licenses and the Boulder Municipal Code. And please, do call the police. I'd love to have them explain the law to you." She pulled out her phone and actually started dialing. I shrugged and put my goggles back on, fired up the chainsaw, and went back to work. The look of shock on her face was almost worth the headache I knew was coming. 20 minutes later, a Boulder police cruiser pulled up in front of my house. I had just finished removing another major dead branch when Officer Martinez approached my backyard. He was a stocky guy in his 40s with a professional demeanor. Patricia stood behind him, arms crossed, wearing a satisfied smirk. I shut off the saw again and walked over to meet them. "Morning, officer," I said, wiping sawdust from my face. "I'm guessing this is about the noise," Officer Martinez nodded. "Got a call about a noise disturbance. Madam here says you're violating HOA rules about power tools before noon on Saturday." "That's right," Patricia interjected. "He's being completely unreasonable and refuses to stop." I held up a hand. "Officer, I'm Blake Garrison, licensed arborist and owner of Garrison Tree Solutions." I'm performing emergency tree removal on a dead oak that's dropping heavy branches. I have all my professional licenses, and the Boulder Municipal Code specifically exempts licensed tree service professionals from noise restrictions when dealing with hazardous trees. Officer Martinez looked at the massive dead oak, then at my professional equipment setup. "Can I see your licenses?" "Absolutely." I walked over to my truck parked in the driveway and retrieved my business binder. Inside were my Colorado State Arborist certification, my business license, liability insurance documentation, and the relevant municipal codes I had printed out after a similar dispute with a client months ago. Martinez took his time reviewing everything. Patricia tapped her foot impatiently. "This doesn't matter. HOA rules are HOA rules." The officer looked up at her. "Actually, Madam, municipal and state laws do supersede HOA regulations in many cases. Mr. Garrison is correct. Licensed tree service professionals are exempt from noise ordinances when performing emergency or hazardous tree removal. This tree is clearly dead and poses a legitimate safety hazard." Patricia's face went from red to nearly purple. "That's ridiculous. So anyone can just get some fake license and make all the noise they want." "It's not a fake license, madam. These are legitimate state certifications. Mr. Garrison is well within his rights to perform this work." Officer Martinez handed back my documents. "You're all clear, Mr. Garrison." "Madam, I'd suggest reviewing the actual municipal codes before making police reports. Filing false complaints can result in citations for misuse of emergency services." Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but Martinez was already walking back to his cruiser. She turned to me with pure venom in her eyes. "This isn't over. The HOA board meets Monday night. We'll see what they have to say about your little loophole." I wanted to respond with something snarky, but I bit my tongue. "Have a nice day, Patricia." She stormed off, and I went back to work. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same woman who had hired an entire landscaping crew to redo her front yard at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday last month was now complaining about my legitimate safety work on a Saturday. But that was Patricia Brennan for you, president of the Meadowbrook Lane Homeowners Association and self-appointed ruler of our little suburban kingdom. I spent the rest of the day cutting down the dead oak, carefully lowering branches with ropes and my rigging system to avoid damage to my fence or shed. By 5 in the evening, I had the main trunk cut into manageable sections and stacked near the curb for the city's bulk pickup service. My back ached and my arms felt like jelly, but at least the dangerous tree was gone. Sunday passed quietly. I spent most of it splitting the oak into firewood and cleaning up the work area. My next-door neighbor, Tom Reynolds, came over around noon. "Heard you had some excitement yesterday," he said, leaning against my fence. Tom was retired military, a straightforward guy who had zero patience for HOA drama. "Patricia being Patricia," I replied, sinking my splitting maul into another log. "She's threatening to bring it up at the board meeting tomorrow night." Tom shook his head. "That woman has too much time on her hands. You know, she sent my wife a violation notice because our house numbers were the wrong font. Apparently they need to be Times New Roman, not Arial." "Who even checks that?" "Someone with nothing better to do," I said. "I'm planning to attend the meeting tomorrow. Should be entertaining if nothing else. Want some backup? Helen and I can come. We've been meaning to attend one anyway, raise some concerns about how the HOA funds are being spent." "That would be great, actually." "Thanks, Tom." Monday evening arrived faster than I would have liked. The HOA meetings were held at the Meadowbrook Community Center, a small building at the entrance of our neighborhood that mainly served as a glorified clubhouse. I arrived at 6:30 for the 7 o'clock meeting, carrying a folder with all my documentation. The community center's main room had about 40 folding chairs set up facing a long table where the 5 board members sat. Patricia occupied the center seat, naturally, flanked by her vice president, Susan Chen, and treasurer, Robert Kimball. The secretary was a quiet woman named Dorothy Walsh, and the member-at-large was Frank Delgado, who owned the largest house in the neighborhood and rarely spoke at meetings. About 15 residents had already arrived, including Tom and his wife Helen. They waved me over to seats they had saved. More people trickled in as 7 approached. By the time Patricia banged her gavel to call the meeting to order, we had maybe 30 people present. The first 20 minutes were mind-numbingly boring. They discussed the landscaping budget for the common areas, debated whether to switch to LED lights for the entrance sign, and reviewed the treasurer's report. I could see Patricia kept glancing my way with barely concealed anticipation. Finally, we reached new business. "I'd like to address a serious violation that occurred this past Saturday morning," Patricia announced, her voice taking on a theatrical quality. One of our residents, Mr. Blake Garrison, was operating a chainsaw at 8:30 in the morning, in clear violation of our noise ordinance that prohibits power tools before noon on weekends. A few heads turned to look at me. I kept my expression neutral. This kind of disregard for our community rules is exactly the type of behavior that degrades our neighborhood's quality of life, Patricia continued. I propose we not only fine Mr. Garrison the standard $500 for a first offense, but add an additional $500 penalty for his refusal to comply when I personally informed him of the violation. Actually, I'd like to address the board, I said, standing up. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. Patricia looked annoyed. This is not the public comment period. Susan Chen leaned over and whispered something to Patricia, who frowned but nodded. Fine, you have 3 minutes. I walked to the front of the room. Thank you. First, I want to provide context. The tree I was removing was completely dead and had already dropped several large branches during recent windstorms. One nearly went through my kitchen window. It was a legitimate safety hazard that required immediate attention. That doesn't excuse violating HOA rules, Patricia interjected. If you'll let me finish, I said firmly. Second, I am a Colorado state licensed arborist and own Garrison Tree Solutions, a fully licensed and insured tree service company. Third, and most importantly, the Boulder Municipal Code specifically exempts licensed tree service professionals from noise ordinances when performing hazardous tree removal. This exemption exists because dead or damaged trees pose safety risks that can't wait for convenient hours. I pulled out copies of the relevant municipal code sections and my licenses, walking them over to the board table. I've made copies for each board member. Section 17-3 of the Boulder Municipal Code clearly states these exemptions. Officer Martinez of the Boulder Police Department confirmed this on site Saturday morning when he responded to Mrs. Brennan's call. The board members began passing around the documents. Frank Delgado actually looked interested for once, reading through the municipal code carefully. Robert Kimball, the treasurer, adjusted his glasses and studied my licenses. Patricia barely glanced at the papers. The HOA covenants that every homeowner signed give us authority over neighborhood matters. Your so-called exemption doesn't apply because you were working on your own property, not as a business. Actually, that's incorrect, I said. The exemption applies to licensed professionals performing tree services, regardless of property ownership. The law recognizes that hazardous trees don't stop being dangerous just because they're on the professional's own property. Additionally, HOA covenants cannot supersede municipal and state law. If there's a conflict, the government law takes precedence. He's right, Frank Delgado said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. Frank was a retired attorney who rarely involved himself in HOA drama. I've been reading through this municipal code section. It's very clear. Licensed tree service professionals are exempt from noise restrictions for hazardous tree work. And HOA covenants absolutely cannot override municipal law. We have no grounds to fine Mr. Garrison. Patricia's face flushed. Frank, surely there's some way to interpret this differently. There isn't, he said flatly. If we issue this fine, Mr. Garrison would have every right to contest it and we'd lose. Moreover, he could potentially sue the HOA for harassment. I strongly recommend we drop this matter entirely. The room had gone completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Patricia looked like she had swallowed a lemon. I agree with Frank, Robert Kimball said. The documentation is solid. We'd be in the wrong here. Susan Chen nodded reluctantly. We should move on. Patricia gripped her gavel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Fine, no fine will be issued. But Mr. Garrison, in the future, a courtesy notification to neighbors about noisy work would be appreciated by the community. I'll keep that in mind, I said, returning to my seat. Tom gave me a subtle thumbs up. The meeting continued with mundane business, but I could barely pay attention. I had won, but something about Patricia's expression concerned me. She didn't look defeated. She looked calculating. After the meeting adjourned, several neighbors came up to congratulate me or ask about tree services. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. Well played, Blake. You had all your ducks in a row. Thanks for coming. That probably helped. As we walked out to the parking lot, I noticed Patricia huddled with Susan Chen near their cars, speaking in low, intense voices. Whatever they were discussing, I doubted it was good news for me. The next few days passed normally. I worked on several client properties around Boulder, removing dead trees, pruning overgrown branches, and grinding stumps. My business had been doing well, and I was grateful for the steady stream of work. Thursday afternoon, I returned home around 4 to find a certified letter wedged in my front door. My stomach sank as I recognized the HOA return address. Inside was a notice of violation, but not for noise. This one cited me for running an unapproved business from residential property, and demanded I immediately cease using my home address as my business address. The fine was $1,000, with an additional $500 per week until compliance. I read it 3 times, anger building with each pass. My business license had listed my home address since I started the company 8 years ago, long before I moved to this neighborhood. I didn't have clients coming to my house. I didn't store commercial equipment on the property beyond my personal truck and tools in my garage. I met clients at their properties, like any legitimate tree service. I immediately called Frank Delgado. If anyone would give me straight answers, it would be him. Frank, it's Blake Garrison. Do you have a few minutes? Sure, Blake. What's going on? I explained the letter. Frank sighed heavily. Let me guess. Patricia's behind this. She's the one who signed it. Blake, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm planning to resign from the board. I only joined because my wife thought it would be good for us to be involved in the community, but I can't stand the petty vindictiveness anymore. Patricia has turned this HOA into her personal fiefdom. I understand, but right now I need to know if this violation has any legal standing. Does your business generate traffic to your property? Do you have employees coming and going? Commercial vehicles beyond a personal work truck? No, none of that. My home address is just my business mailing address. Everything else happens on site at clients' properties. Then they have no case, Frank said. Most HOA covenants prohibit businesses that create nuisances or excessive traffic. Using your home address for business registration is completely normal and legal. Push back hard on this, Blake. Don't let them bully you. Thanks, Frank. I appreciate your honesty. After hanging up, I drafted a formal response letter citing the relevant HOA covenant sections and explaining that my business use of the address fell well within allowable parameters. I documented that I had no commercial signage, no client traffic, no employees reporting to the location, and no commercial storage beyond what would be normal for any homeowner who happened to own tools. I sent it certified mail Friday morning. Saturday morning at 9, I was in my garage organizing equipment when Patricia's white Mercedes SUV pulled into my driveway. She got out wearing designer sunglasses and another expensive tracksuit, this one in coral. I walked out to meet her, keeping my expression neutral. Patricia, what can I do for you? I got your response letter, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I wanted to discuss this situation personally, neighbor to neighbor, before it escalates further. I'm listening. She removed her sunglasses, her eyes cold despite her smile. Blake, you're new to the neighborhood, relatively speaking. You might not understand how we do things here. The HOA maintains property values through consistent enforcement of our standards. When someone starts pushing boundaries, testing loopholes, it sets a bad precedent. I'm not testing loopholes. I'm running a legitimate business and living in my home. Nothing I'm doing violates any actual rules. That's a matter of interpretation, she said. The board has significant discretion in how we interpret covenant violations. We could make your life very difficult, Blake. Constant inspections, citations for minor infractions that we might normally overlook for cooperative residents. Or, she paused dramatically, you could work with us. Work with you how? Pay the fine. Move your business address to a P.O. box or commercial location. Acknowledge the HOA's authority in these matters. In exchange, we'll be more flexible with any future minor issues. I felt my hands clench into fists, but I kept them at my sides. So this is extortion. Her smile vanished. It's community management. Every HOA operates this way. Don't be naive. I'm not paying a fine for something that isn't a violation. My business address stays as is my legal right. And if you want to send your goons around for inspections, make sure everything you cite is legitimate, because I'll contest every single item that isn't. Patricia put her sunglasses back on. You're making a mistake. I tried to do this the friendly way. There's nothing friendly about threats and extortion, I said. I think you should leave my property now. She returned to her Mercedes without another word, but the way she peeled out of my driveway told me everything I needed to know about her state of mind. Tom appeared at the fence line moments later. Was that Patricia? What did she want? To threaten me into compliance, I said. This is getting ridiculous. You need to document everything, Tom advised. Every interaction, every letter, every conversation. My gut says this is going to get worse before it gets better. He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more violation notices. One claimed my truck was parked on the street overnight, which was allegedly prohibited between 2 and 6 a.m. Another stated my lawn had weeds that exceeded acceptable levels. The third cited me for having a ladder visible in my garage when the door was open, claiming stored equipment must be screened from view. I contested all 3 with photographic evidence and covenant citations. My truck had been in my driveway both nights in question, which my doorbell camera footage proved. The weeds were native wildflowers I had deliberately planted as part of a pollinator garden, which the covenants specifically allowed. and the covenant section about screening equipment applied only to boats, RVs, and trailers, not tools in an open garage. Each response required hours of work, research, and documentation. I was spending more time fighting the HOA than running my business. My stress levels were through the roof, and I had trouble sleeping. The breaking point came 3 weeks after the board meeting. I arrived home from a long day of work around 6 p.m. to find my front door standing open. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed a large branch trimmer from my truck and cautiously approached. "Hello," I called out. "Anyone here?" No response. I stepped inside, my mind racing through whether I should call the police first. The house looked undisturbed. Nothing seemed stolen or vandalized. But then I reached my home office. Every drawer had been pulled open. Papers were scattered across the desk and floor. My filing cabinet stood open, folders askew. Someone had gone through my business records, my personal files, everything. I immediately called 911. Boulder police sent out 2 officers, including a detective named Sarah Morrison. They took statements, dusted for prints, and photographed the scene. "Anything missing?" Detective Morrison asked as she surveyed the office. "I don't think so. It looks like someone was searching for something rather than stealing. My laptop's still here, my camera equipment in the other room. Nothing valuable seems gone." "Any idea what they might have been looking for?" I hesitated, then explained the ongoing HOA dispute. Detective Morrison listened carefully, taking notes. "So you think this might be related to your conflict with the HOA president?" "I don't want to make accusations without proof, but the timing is suspicious." "We'll investigate thoroughly," she assured me. "Do you have a security system?" "Just a doorbell camera, but it's pointed at the street, not the door itself." I pulled up the footage on my phone. The video showed a white work van pulling up around 2 p.m. 2 men in coveralls got out carrying clipboards, but they had baseball caps pulled low and kept their faces turned away from the camera. They walked up to my door, and then the footage showed them leaving about 20 minutes later, getting into the van and driving away. The license plate was obscured with mud. "That's professional," Detective Morrison noted. "Send me that footage. We'll see if we can enhance it and identify the vehicle or individuals." After the police left, I called a locksmith and had all my locks changed that night. I also ordered a comprehensive security system with cameras covering every entrance. Tom came over when he saw the police cars. "What the hell happened?" I explained the break-in. His expression grew darker as I talked. "Blake, this has gone too far. You need to talk to a lawyer." "I know. I'm calling one tomorrow." That night I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. I kept thinking about someone going through my personal files, invading my space. What had they been looking for? HOA documents, business records, something to use against me. The next morning, I contacted an attorney named Michael Shaw, who specialized in HOA disputes and property law. His office was in downtown Boulder, in a modern building near the courthouse. Michael was in his 50s, with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. I laid out everything that had happened since the chainsaw incident. Michael took extensive notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This is a clear pattern of harassment," he said when I finished. "The escalating violations, the threats, and now a potential break-in. Have the police connected Patricia or anyone from the HOA board to the break-in?" "Not yet. The investigation is ongoing. Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm sending a cease and desist letter to the HOA demanding they stop the harassing violations. Second, we're filing a formal complaint with the Colorado HOA Regulatory Office. Third, We're going to request a full audit of how the HOA has been issuing fines and whether there's a pattern of selective enforcement or financial impropriety. How much is this going to cost me? Michael named a retainer fee that made me wince, but I paid it. I was beyond the point of backing down. The cease and desist letter went out that afternoon. 2 days later, Detective Morrison called me. "Mr. Garrison, I wanted to update you on the investigation. We were able to enhance the video footage and got a partial license plate. It traces back to a property maintenance company called Boulder Property Services. When we contacted them, they claimed they had been hired for an HOA inspection at your address." My blood ran cold. The HOA hired them. That's what they claim. They said they had authorization to enter the property to photograph code violations. We're looking into whether that authorization was legitimate and whether they exceeded their scope. Detective, the HOA has no right to enter my home without permission, regardless of any inspection. I agree. We're pursuing this as a breaking and entering case. I'll keep you updated. I immediately called Michael Shaw and relayed the information. He sounded energized. "This is huge, Blake. If the HOA authorized an illegal entry, that's criminal trespass at minimum, potentially breaking and entering. We can use this." The following Monday, I attended another HOA board meeting, this time with Michael at my side. The room was more crowded than usual. Word had spread about the break-in and the ongoing disputes. Tom and Helen were there, along with several other neighbors who had their own grievances with Patricia's management style. Patricia looked surprised when she saw me walk in with an attorney. Her confidence wavered for just a moment before she masked it with a cold smile. The meeting began with standard business, but tension hung thick in the air. When we reached new business, Michael stood. "Michael Shaw, attorney for Blake Garrison. I'm here regarding the ongoing harassment my client has faced from this board, culminating in an illegal entry into his home last week." Patricia's face went pale. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Really?" "Because Boulder Property Services, the company whose employees broke into Mr. Garrison's home, claims they were hired by this HOA to conduct an inspection." "Do you deny authorizing that inspection?" The other board members looked confused. Susan Chen leaned forward. "Patricia, what is he talking about? We never voted on any inspection." Patricia's mouth opened and closed. There must be some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Michael continued. "The police have confirmed that individuals working for Boulder Property Services illegally entered my client's home without permission or proper authorization. They rifled through his personal documents and business records. This is a criminal matter, and it appears to have been orchestrated by this HOA board's president." Robert Kimball looked shocked. "Patricia, did you really do this?" "I hired them to do an exterior inspection," Patricia said, her voice rising. "If they went inside, that was their mistake, not mine." "Do you have documentation of this authorization?" Michael asked. "A board resolution, written instructions." Patricia fumbled with her papers, her hands shaking. I don't need board approval for routine inspections." "Actually, you do," Frank Delgado said quietly. "Our bylaws require board approval for any expenditure over $200 and for any inspections beyond simple drive-by observations. You acted unilaterally, Patricia, and apparently authorized an illegal entry." The room erupted in conversation. Several residents began shouting questions at Patricia. Michael raised his voice to be heard. "I have a cease and desist letter for the board. This harassment of my client ends now. All pending fines are dropped. All future violations must be legitimate, documented, and applied consistently across all residents. Furthermore, I'm recommending that Mr. Garrison file a personal lawsuit against Mrs. Brennan for harassment, and that the HOA consider whether she should remain in her position as president." "This is outrageous," Patricia shouted. "I've served this community for 6 years. I've kept our property values high and our neighborhood beautiful. One troublemaker shows up and suddenly I'm the villain. You authorized breaking into my home," I said, standing up. My voice was shaking with anger. "You've sent me fraudulent violation notices. You've threatened me. You've abused your position to settle a personal vendetta because I had the audacity to know my legal rights. That's not community service, Patricia. That's tyranny." Several people applauded. Patricia looked around the room desperately but found no support. Even Susan Chen had moved her chair slightly away. "I move for a vote of no confidence in the board president," Frank Delgado said. "All in favor?" 4 hands went up, everyone except Patricia. She slammed her gavel down. "You can't do this. There are procedures. Actually, the bylaws allow for an immediate vote of no confidence with a unanimous vote of the remaining board members," Frank said. "You're removed as president, effective immediately. Susan, as vice president, you're now acting president." Patricia stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "This is illegal. I'll sue every one of you." "Please do," Michael said calmly. "It'll make the countersuit easier." Patricia grabbed her purse and stormed out, nearly knocking over a chair on her way. The room sat in stunned silence for a moment. Susan Chen cleared her throat nervously. "Well, I suppose we should continue the meeting." The rest of the meeting was a blur. The board formally dropped all pending violations against me, apologized on behalf of the HOA, and agreed to cooperate fully with the police investigation. They also voted to hire an independent management company to review HOA procedures and ensure compliance with Colorado law. Tom caught up with me in the parking lot afterward. "Holy hell, Blake, that was something." "I just want to go home and sleep for a week," I admitted. My hands were still shaking from adrenaline. "Buy you a beer," Tom offered. "I think we could both use one." We went to a nearby bar and spent an hour decompressing. Tom had his own stories about Patricia's overreach, including the time she had tried to fine him for having a vegetable garden in his backyard, because it wasn't aesthetically consistent with the neighborhood landscape plan. "The thing that gets me," Tom said, nursing his beer, "is how she genuinely seemed to believe she was in the right. Like rules existed to serve her ego rather than the community." "Power corrupts," I said, "especially small power over small domains." "She probably started with good intentions and just lost perspective over time." The police investigation continued over the next few weeks. Detective Morrison kept me updated on the progress. The Boulder Property Services employees claimed Patricia had told them to do a thorough interior inspection and that she would handle permission from the homeowner. She had paid them in cash, which raised additional red flags. The district attorney's office got involved. Patricia was charged with criminal trespass and conspiracy to commit breaking and entering. Boulder Property Services faced charges too, though the DA seemed willing to offer them a deal if they testified against Patricia. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for December. Michael Shaw encouraged me to attend. "It's important for the judge to see the victim's face," he explained. "It makes it real." The hearing took place at the Boulder County Courthouse on a cold December morning. I took the day off work and wore my best suit. Michael met me outside the courtroom. Patricia arrived with her own attorney, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit. She had lost weight since I'd last seen her. Her face looked drawn, and the confident superiority was gone, replaced by barely concealed anxiety. The hearing itself was procedural. The prosecution laid out the charges and evidence. Patricia's attorney argued that his client had no criminal intent, that it was a misunderstanding, that she had believed she had authority to authorize the inspection. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Catherine Reeves, wasn't buying it. "Mrs. Brennan, you held a position of trust in your community," Judge Reeves said. "You abused that position to harass a resident and authorized illegal entry into his home. The evidence suggests this was deliberate retaliation for his refusal to be intimidated by your misuse of HOA authority. I'm binding this over for trial." Patricia's attorney tried to argue for dismissal, but Judge Reeves shut him down quickly. We had a trial date set for February. As we left the courthouse, Patricia's attorney approached Michael and me. "My client is interested in discussing a settlement," he said quietly. Michael looked at me. "It's your call, Blake." "I'm listening," I said. Over the next week, we negotiated through attorneys. Patricia would plead guilty to a reduced charge of criminal trespass. She would pay restitution for my legal fees, my security system, and additional damages. She would resign from the HOA board permanently and agree not to seek any position in the HOA for at least 5 years. In exchange, I would not pursue a separate civil lawsuit. The deal was finalized in January. Patricia paid me $42,000 in total restitution. She received 2 years probation and community service. She also had to write a formal letter of apology, which arrived in my mailbox on a snowy January afternoon. The letter was stiff and clearly written by her attorney, but it acknowledged her wrongdoing and apologized for the harassment and illegal entry. I filed it away without much thought. Some things can't be fixed with apologies. Life in the Meadowbrook Lane neighborhood gradually returned to normal. Susan Chen proved to be a much more reasonable HOA president. She implemented transparency measures, regular community meetings, and clear appeals processes for violations. The board hired a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations, which removed a lot of the personal vendettas from the equation. Frank Delgado did end up resigning from the board, as he had planned, but he recommended his neighbor, a retired school principal named Margaret Hayes, to replace him. She brought common sense and fairness to the board's decisions. I kept my business address as my home address, continued working as an arborist, and occasionally used my chainsaw before noon when necessary for safety reasons. Nobody complained. One Saturday morning in March, I was having coffee on my back deck when Tom walked over with his dog, a friendly golden retriever named Buster. "Nice morning," he called out. "Beautiful," I agreed. "Want some coffee?" He joined me on the deck, and we sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching birds in the trees. "You know, I've been thinking about that whole situation," Tom said eventually. "What you did, standing up to Patricia like that, it wasn't just about you. She'd been running roughshod over people for years. Most of us just kept our heads down and paid the fines and followed her arbitrary rules because it was easier than fighting." "I get it," I said. "I almost did the same thing. But you didn't. And now the whole neighborhood is better for it. The new board actually serves the community instead of ruling over it. So, thank you." I felt a lump in my throat. "Thanks, Tom. That means a lot." My business thrived in the months that followed. Word had spread about my victory over the HOA, and I gained several new clients who appreciated that I knew building codes, municipal ordinances, and property law as well as I knew trees. One client, a lawyer with her own HOA issues, hired me and then referred me to 3 of her colleagues. I also started teaching a workshop at the local community college on homeowner rights and HOA law. It was just a weekend seminar, but it filled up immediately. Apparently, I wasn't the only person who had faced HOA overreach. In April, the Meadowbrook HOA held its annual meeting and election. Susan Chen was elected to a full term as president by unanimous vote. The residents also voted to amend the covenants to add stronger protections for homeowners, including mandatory waiting periods before fines could be assessed, clear appeals processes, and prohibitions on retaliatory enforcement. Patricia Brennan put her house up for sale in May. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was moving to Arizona to be closer to her daughter. I felt a complicated mix of emotions when I saw the for sale sign go up. Relief, certainly, but also a strange sadness. She had made my life hell for months, but she had also been a person who made mistakes and paid for them. I hoped she would find some peace and perspective in her new life. The house sold quickly to a young couple with a toddler. They introduced themselves as David and Rachel Porter. David was a software engineer who worked from home, and Rachel was a nurse at Boulder Community Hospital. "We heard about the HOA drama," Rachel said when they came over to introduce themselves. "That was actually one reason we felt confident buying here. The fact that the community handled it and made real changes, that says something good about the neighborhood." "It's a good place to live," I agreed. "Welcome to Meadowbrook Lane." Summer arrived with warm sunshine and afternoon thunderstorms rolling down from the Rockies. I stayed busy with tree work, splitting my time between storm damage removal and routine maintenance. My back deck became a regular evening gathering spot for neighbors. Tom and Helen, David and Rachel, and several others would drop by after work for beers and conversation. One evening in July, we were all lounging on the deck watching the sunset paint the mountains orange and purple. Someone asked me if I had any regrets about how I handled the Patricia situation. I thought about it for a long moment. Not really. I wish it hadn't been necessary. I wish Patricia had been reasonable from the start. But once it became clear she wasn't going to be, I'm glad I stood my ground. Some things are worth fighting for. "Like the right to use a chainsaw before noon," David joked. Everyone laughed, including me. "Like the right to live in your own home without being harassed by petty tyrants," I corrected. The chainsaw was just where it started. As darkness fell and the fireflies began their nightly dance across the lawn, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The ordeal with Patricia and the HOA had been stressful, expensive, and time-consuming. But it had also taught me important lessons about standing up for principles, about community, and about how ordinary people can resist bureaucratic overreach when they work together. The Meadowbrook Lane HOA was now a genuine community organization rather than a tool for one person's ego. Neighbors looked out for each other. Rules were applied fairly and consistently. Disputes were handled with reason rather than retaliation. Sometimes, I would fire up my chainsaw early on a Saturday morning to handle a dead branch or a dangerous tree. The sound no longer brought an angry Patricia storming across lawns. Instead, sometimes Tom would wander over to watch and offer unsolicited advice about my cutting technique. Or David would bring his daughter over to watch from a safe distance, her eyes wide with fascination at the big machine and falling trees. The following year, the HOA nominated me for the board during the annual election. I declined politely but firmly. I had no interest in HOA politics, even now that the organization functioned properly. I was content to live my life, run my business, and enjoy my home without drama. My business continued to grow. I hired 2 employees, both young guys fresh out of arboriculture programs, eager to learn the trade. Teaching them gave me satisfaction I hadn't expected. Watching them develop skills, learn to read trees, and understand the deeper aspects of the work reminded me why I had fallen in love with this profession in the first place. One autumn morning, almost exactly 2 years after the chainsaw incident that started everything, I was working on a large oak removal in North Boulder. My crew was rigging ropes while I planned the cuts. My phone rang. It was an unknown local number, but I answered anyway. Blake Garrison. Mr. Garrison, this is Judge Catherine Reeves. I presided over the Brennan case. You have a moment. I was surprised but curious. Of course, Your Honor. What can I do for you? I have a large dead elm in my backyard that's concerning me. I've been meaning to get it removed, and several colleagues recommended you highly. Would you be available to give me an estimate? I smiled. I'd be happy to. When works for you? We scheduled an appointment for that evening. When I arrived at Judge Reeves' home in a beautiful older neighborhood near downtown Boulder, she greeted me warmly and led me to her backyard. The elm was indeed dead and would need to come down soon. As I examined it and took measurements, Judge Reeves watched from her patio. You know, she said when I finished, your case made an impression on me, not just because of the specific issues involved, but because of how you handled yourself. A lot of people would have either backed down from the fight or handled it with anger and spite. You did neither. You stood up for your rights, but you also showed restraint and professionalism. Thank you, Your Honor. I was fortunate to have good legal representation. Michael Shaw is excellent, she agreed, but the attorney can only work with what the client gives them. You documented everything. You knew the relevant laws, and you stayed focused on the actual issues rather than getting personal. That discipline made all the difference. I gave her a quote for the elm removal. She hired me on the spot, and we scheduled the work for the following week. As I drove home that evening through Boulder's tree-lined streets, I reflected on how far I had come from that Saturday morning 2 years ago when Patricia had stormed onto my lawn in her lavender tracksuit, convinced that her HOA authority trumped all other considerations. The truth was, the entire ordeal had changed me in ways both subtle and profound. I was more confident now, more willing to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. I had learned that bureaucratic bullies rely on people being too intimidated or too tired to fight back, and that sometimes the simple act of saying no and holding your ground was enough to make them crumble. I had also learned about the importance of community. Tom and Helen's support, Frank's legal knowledge, the other neighbors who had attended meetings and spoken up, even David and Rachel's decision to buy into the neighborhood because of how we had handled the crisis. None of it happened in isolation. Change required people working together, supporting each other, refusing to let the tyrants pick them off one by one. The following spring marked 3 years since I had moved to Meadowbrook Lane. The neighborhood held a community barbecue at the park near the entrance. Nearly every household attended, along with Susan Chen and the rest of the HOA board. I brought my famous smoked brisket, which took 16 hours to prepare properly. Tom and Helen brought their amazing potato salad. David and Rachel brought enough homemade cookies to feed a small army. Other neighbors contributed everything from grilled vegetables to craft beer to fresh lemonade. Children ran around playing tag and throwing frisbees. Adults clustered in groups, talking and laughing. The HOA board circulated among residents, but casually, as neighbors rather than authorities. Susan Chen's husband manned one of the grills, flipping burgers and joking with people waiting in line. At one point, Susan pulled me aside. "I want to thank you again," she said. "I know I've said it before, but I mean it. Before everything that happened with Patricia, I was enabling her behavior. I told myself I was keeping the peace or picking my battles, but really I was just taking the path of least resistance. You forced all of us to do better." "You did the hard work," I said. "You stepped up when it mattered. We all did," she replied. That's what makes this a real community. As the sun set and people began to drift home, I stayed to help clean up. Tom worked alongside me, loading folding tables into his truck to return to the community center. "You know what the best part of all this is?" Tom said as we secured the last table. "It's not even that Patricia is gone or that the HOA functions better now. What is it? It's that we all know we can handle whatever comes next. We proved we can come together and solve problems. That's worth more than perfect lawn maintenance schedules or matching mailboxes." He was right. The HOA still had rules, still enforced standards, still collected dues and maintained common areas. But it did so with common sense, fairness, and respect for residents. And if someone in the future tried to abuse that system the way Patricia had, the neighborhood would be ready. I drove home through streets I now knew intimately. I could identify most of the trees just by their silhouettes against the darkening sky. I knew which ones were healthy and which ones would need attention soon. I knew my neighbors, their families, their quirks and qualities. This was my community, and I had fought for my place in it. My house looked welcoming as I pulled into the driveway. The new oak sapling I had planted where the dead tree once stood was thriving, already showing strong growth. In 20 years, it would provide shade and beauty for whoever lived here. Maybe it would be me. Maybe it would be someone else. But either way, that tree would stand as a reminder that sometimes things have to be cut down before new growth can flourish. Inside, I poured myself a beer and stood on my back deck, looking out at the yard where this whole saga had begun. The stump of the dead oak was long gone, ground down and covered with new grass. The saw marks on the fence posts where I had stacked wood had weathered and faded. Physical evidence of that morning had vanished, but the changes it catalyzed remained. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael Shaw. "Congratulations on the 3-year anniversary of your case. Hope life is treating you well." I smiled and typed back, "Life is good. Thanks for everything." It was true. Life was good. My business was thriving. My home was peaceful. My neighborhood was a genuine community. And if I needed to fire up my chainsaw at 8 in the morning to handle a dangerous tree, I could do so without worrying about a middle-aged woman in an expensive tracksuit storming across my lawn with threats and citations. The Boulder night air carried the scent of pine from the mountains and fresh-cut grass from surrounding lawns. Somewhere in the neighborhood, someone was playing music. A dog barked. A car door slammed. The normal sounds of people living their lives. I thought about Patricia sometimes, wondered if she had found peace in Arizona, if she had learned anything from what happened. I hoped so. I bore her no ill will, just a lingering sadness that someone had let power and pettiness consume them to the point of criminality. But mostly, I thought about the future. The jobs I would do, the trees I would save or remove, the clients I would help, the employees I would train. The simple satisfaction of skilled work done well. The pleasure of coming home to a place where I belonged, where I was part of something larger than myself. As I finished my beer and headed inside, I passed the framed municipal code section hanging in my hallway. I had gotten it printed and framed as a reminder and a joke for myself. Section 17-3, the Noise Ordinance Exemption for Licensed Tree Services. Such a small piece of bureaucratic language, but it had been the foundation for everything that followed. I locked the door behind me, set the security system I no longer really needed but kept anyway, and headed upstairs. Tomorrow was Monday, and I had 3 jobs scheduled. Life went on, as it always does, and I was grateful for every ordinary moment of it. The story of HOA President Patricia Brennan and her attempted tyranny over Meadowbrook Lane became a local legend in Boulder. Other neighborhoods used it as a cautionary tale in HOA board training sessions. Lawyers cited the case when advising clients about HOA disputes. And somewhere in Arizona, I hoped, a middle-aged woman thought twice before letting power go to her head. As for me, I was just Blake Garrison, arborist and homeowner, living my life in a neighborhood that had learned the difference between community standards and authoritarian control. And if that life sometimes began with the sound of a chainsaw before noon on a Saturday morning, well, that was perfectly legal, properly licensed, and none of anyone's business but my own.